Hello and welcome back to Introduction to Astronomy. Today we're going to be doing lab number 16 on spectroscopic parallax. So you're going to want to go to Canvas, then Modules, then Labs, and then under Labs go to the Unit 3 Labs on stars. And then once you open the document, then go down to where it says 16 spectroscopic parallax down at the bottom and click on that tab. Okay, so have you found it? Alright, so we're going to do the concept introduction first, and then we will come back up and look at the pre-lab questions. Okay, so under the concept introduction it says, in the lab on stellar parallax, we use the parallax angle of a star to calculate its distance from Earth using trigonometry. So just to refresh your memory, you looked at a star in like January, and then you looked at the same star in, let's say, July, 6 months later. And what you would notice is that star would have shifted with respect to the background stars. And then we could measure the angle that that represents, which is called the parallax angle, and then we plugged it into the parallax formula, which was r equals 1 over the parallax angle. So that was an experiment that we've already done in here. Now this method, however, is limited to stars that are less than 1,000 light years away, because the parallax angle gets so small that you just can't notice that those stars are moving anymore. So we're going to have to come up with a different way of measuring the distance to these further away stars, and this method is going to be called the spectroscopic method. So in order to find the distance to stars that are further, spectral parallax is used. To use the spectroscopic parallax method, number one, the relative magnitude of a star is found using a photometer. So if you recall, we've always said that a photometer measures apparent brightness, F. Well, where have you heard the word magnitude before? Okay, do you remember the ancient Greeks? Back in unit number 1, I said that the ancient Greeks, they didn't have high-powered mathematics back then, so they would look at a star and would say, that looks like a magnitude 1 star to me. And then this other star looks like it's 2.5 times dimmer, so that's going to be a magnitude 2 type star, and so forth. So that's where the magnitude scale came from. And so there is a scientist took that method and they made it more mathematical by coming up with the relative magnitude of a star. So the point is that the relative magnitude of a star is related to the apparent brightness of the star. And we can find the relative magnitude of a star by using a photometer, the same way that we find the apparent brightness of a star. Okay, now the second thing that we need to know is that the maximum wavelength of light can be found with a spectroscope. So if you recall, when you use a spectroscope, you get the black body curve. And so let me put that up here on the board behind me. So a black body curve is going to have the brightness going this way, and then it's going to have the wavelength going this way, and then it made a curve like that. So that was called a black body. And then there was one particular color in the black body where it would be the brightest. So you see that this corresponds to the brightest color, and so we're going to call this lambda maximum. So that's the wavelength of light that corresponds to where it's having its hump at. And that, in turn, was related to Wien's law. So Wien's law was the one that said that the lambda maximum is equal to 0.0029 divided by T, where T is the temperature of it. So once we put a diffraction grating on our telescope, and then we look at the colors of light produced by that star, and then we can turn that into a black body curve. And then from that curve, we can find which color of light is the brightest, and then from that, we can figure out what the temperature of the star was. Okay, then that's exactly what we're doing in part 3 there. So the third step is to find the surface temperature calculated using Wien's law. So we got the maximum wavelength back in part 2, and then we're using that number in part 3 to figure out the temperature. But you'll notice that it says 2.898 times 10 to the 6th divided by lambda maximum, whereas I always said that it was 0.0029. So it is the same formula, it's the units that are different. So the units that I like to use are meters. So I always use the formula that the maximum wavelength was equal to 0.0029 divided by T. That would have given you your maximum wavelength in meters. But in this particular lab, we're going to be measuring the maximum wavelength in nanometers. And so that's why we're using that particular form of the equation. Okay, let's go down a little bit further into the lab. So once you have the, on part 4 it says the absolute magnitude, which is similar to actual brightness, which is the luminosity. So absolute magnitude is sort of like luminosity. And that can be found by, if you know the temperature, you can look the temperature up on the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram and then bounce it off the main sequence and then over to the luminosity. So now we could get the absolute magnitude by using an HR diagram. So notice that this is a pretty complicated lab because we're using everything that we know about the HR diagram and then also Wien's law and black bodies and photometry, because in the next part, let's go down to step 5, it says that the distance to the star can be determined using the inverse square law of light. Now the one that we always used was the photometry equation, which was equation 16.2. But the one that we're going to use in today's lab is the one that relates the relative magnitude to the absolute magnitude. And it's based on the photometry equation, but notice it's written in terms of logarithms, which we'll talk about later. But we're going to be using equation 16.3, or we can use the graph that's underneath it. So it all depends on the magnitude of the numbers. Sometimes the numbers are so big it doesn't fit on the graph, and then we have to use formula 16.3 in order to do it. Okay, so hopefully you learned something from going through that pre-lab. So let me stop the video, and when we come back, we're going to actually go to the pre-lab at the very top of the lab.